Welcome to our Professional Practices Alliance session on partner remuneration. How you can use your partner remuneration system to drive your firm's strategy. This is a taster session following a live session that we held a couple of months ago, which was very well received, and we thought it would be useful to do a recorded version so that more people can see it and enjoy it. We have a fabulous panel here this morning. On my right, Corin Staves, who is a very well-known, highly regarded partnership lawyer from Morris Turner Gardner. David Shufflebotham, who is a newly founder of Pep Up Consulting, in a previous life global head of HR at a leading law firm, but now in his new guise as partner remuneration specialist and advisor. So thank you, David, for coming. My partner, Bettina Bender. Bettina is partner at CM Murray. She is an employment and partnership law specialist and advises lots of firms and partners on a whole range of issues, including partner remuneration. So we have a number of things to talk about today. The first thing I would mention is that we carried out as an alliance a really interesting survey into some issues relating to partner remuneration, how respondents felt about their own firm's partner remuneration system, things where they could be improved, and it's worth taking the time to have a look at that if you're interested. Just a few kind of headline snippets. Interestingly, 81% of respondents thought that their partner remuneration criteria were clear, but 33%, so a third, thought their own system was not transparent enough. 73% they trusted the system to produce fair results, but almost a quarter didn't. And that's a significant proportion, a significant minority, especially if it includes high earners who have the ability to influence the future and strategy of the firm. So we'll maybe bring out some of those issues as we go along, but it's worth having a look at those survey results, and we're obviously always interested in feedback. So we're going to do this as a discussion between us, and we're going to kick off with Corin. Can you just talk us through the different types of remuneration models that firms use, and maybe some of the pros and cons, and perhaps some recent trends?
Absolutely. Well, there's a spectrum of different models that firms use for their remuneration systems. At one end of the spectrum, we've got the pure lockstep model, and that means that partners are remunerated according to their level on the profit sharing ladder, and partners move up incrementally, usually just as a product of the passage of time. The idea behind using a mechanism like this is that it should encourage collegiality. It should focus everybody on the firm's bottom line. Everybody should be collectively working towards the same goal. It should be encouraging cross-selling across the firm, because everybody's trying to make sure the work is carried out by the correct people rather than keeping work for themselves. And it should encourage loyalty, because the longer you stay with the firm and contribute to its success, the more reward you eventually get over the years. Critics of pure lockstep would argue that there is a risk of passengers, because if you're on sort of the pure lockstep, you can sit and you can gradually get remunerated at a higher and higher level purely by remaining at the firm, and it's not necessarily in any way linked to your performance. So it's really important that there's a strong performance management system that supports a lockstep model.
Which is often one of the downfalls, because firms aren't necessarily good and strong enough at performance management.
Absolutely, I think that's one of the reasons why people feel that pure lockstep just doesn't work, because firms don't manage performance appropriately enough. And then there's the really thorny question of, assuming you do have a pure lockstep model, how long should somebody sit at the top of the lockstep? Should it be a finite period? Should you be able to get there at 40 and then stay there till 60, so 20 years? Who knows? Or even longer, of course. Thinking about how one might describe pure lockstep, people often describe it as an escalator. And so at the start of your career as a partner, you go in at the bottom of the escalator and you just stand on the escalator, and you go up several different floors all the way to the top of the escalator, and nothing happens to make you come off the escalator. subject, of course, to your performance being so poor that somebody pushes you off the side of the escalator as you leave the firm. So, what we sometimes see as well is what's described as a modified lockstep, which is very similar to the pure lockstep model, except that there are certain gates at certain levels, which means you have to get over certain performance management sort of hurdles and prove your performance before you're allowed to continue up the escalator, which is very, in terms of the behaviours it encourages, you get the same idea of collegiality, but the idea being there that there is an element of performance management there, and I guess that goes some way towards trying to prevent against passengers going right the way up to the top without sort of their performance being called into question. Thinking about my escalator analogy, that's like these department stores where you, instead of getting one long escalator from the ground floor to the third floor, you get these single-story escalators where you have to sort of go round and go up each story individually, and there's some kind of burly bouncer at the bottom of each escalator stopping you from going unless you can sort of answer some kind of quiz. At the complete opposite end of the spectrum is a pure merit-based system. It's sometimes called an eat what you kill system, and partners are remunerated according to their performance. That means that their individual success is directly linked to their remuneration, so it can go up and down year on year depending on individual performance. People argue that this rewards entrepreneurial behaviour and encourages sort of flair and sort of people to go out there and really drive the business forward. But of course, one of the difficulties there is trying to work out how you link the remuneration to success. Is it simply a financial KPI either? So for example, the person with the largest billings gets it, but how do you then balance, people who introduce work to other people who have management responsibilities and so on? So it can be quite difficult to identify the sort of the correct metrics for rewarding how performance is measured. And critics of that system might argue as well that it encourages what sometimes people call dog bowling, which is keeping the work to themselves, enhancing their practice and not necessarily pushing the work to the people who are real specialists in that area. It can also, in some circumstances, encourage internally competitive behaviours, which can't be very healthy for the business as a whole. My analogy for that is a flight of stairs. The faster you run up the stairs, the quicker you get to the top, and the more effort you put in, the more reward you get, which is fairly straightforward, really. And then I suppose we get these hybrid systems, which are described by some as the best of both worlds. So you'll get an element of lockstep, so it rewards loyalty, collegiality, and you sort of over time you move up the lockstep the longer you stay in the firm, possibly with gates, possibly not, depends on the firm's approach. And then at other times, part of the remuneration award will be linked to performance. So if you meet certain KPIs, you'll also get a discretionary share of the bonus pool, say, enabling individual performance to be rewarded year on year, and it recognises then high spots and low spots for each partner. In going back to my analogy, which is starting to struggle a little bit now, it's like the long escalator, or possibly the individual escalators, and you're up there, and then if you start to run really fast on the spot, somebody sort of throws a bag of cash at you, maybe. So that's about it, really. So we've had an opportunity to think about some of the models that firms use. You asked also about what firms actually do in practice, and the Association of Partnership Practitioners undertook a survey in 2011 and then again in 2015, I think, where they looked at the different systems that firms use to remunerate their partners. And that survey has revealed that at the moment 53% of firms are operating a lockstep system, but of that lockstep system, only a quarter of those firms are actually operating a pure lockstep system, whereas if you look at the survey in 2011, that figure was around about 10% more firms were operating a pure lockstep model, which suggests the trend towards moving away from a pure lockstep to something else. And in the current survey, 56% of firms were using performance gates to modify their locksteps as well. In terms of how long the lockstep for these firms is, 57% of the firms are using a lockstep which is between 5 and 8 years long, and only 29% have got a lockstep that's between 8 and 10 years long. By contrast, in 2011, and we didn't quite use exactly the same metrics there, but 60% of firms were using a lockstep of 6 to 12 years. So that tends to suggest a trend towards bringing the lockstep down and making it a shorter lockstep, period, so the escalator getting shorter in length, really.
And there are very good reasons for that, some of which we'll pick up on later with Bettina and some of the discrimination issues.
Absolutely.
Okay. So thank you, Corinne.
Thank you.
So David, we've got this wonderful range of options. How does a firm decide which sort of remuneration structure is best for them and for their partners and for their long-term business strategy?
A really good question, and the first point I'd like to make is that actually all of the systems that Corinne has mentioned can work, and they do work because we see some very successful firms operating on a eat what you kill basis, some very successful firms operating a pure lockstep. Where you find yourself within that range often tends to be an accident of history. So I think, as Corinne has said and pointed out through the survey results, what we're seeing over time is a shift away from pure lockstep to a more managed system. But what you sometimes find is that firms' systems lag a bit behind the actuality of their business. So there are two really strong factors that you can use to help work out where your remuneration system should be, not necessarily where it is. So this is good in theory, and you can help firms look at their system and say, okay, we may not be in the right place at the moment, where should we be? The question is, how do you get there? So the two factors I tend to use when I'm looking at this with businesses, on the one hand, is what's the variability and contribution within the partnership cohort. So by this I mean you may have a set of partners or individual partners who are producing high levels of revenue and profit for the business, and others who are producing significantly less. But it may well be that your client base is telling you that you need to service both ends of that spectrum. So in that case, you'll have a firm that's serving its clients really well, but actually the partners are delivering quite different contributions to the business. So how do you cope with that? I'll come on to that in a second. You've then got to look at the other axis and the other factors, and really that's what's the competition like in the market. So if there's a very high chance that you're going to lose partners because they don't feel they're being paid enough, so there's a high risk of poaching in the market, then if you combine that with this high degree of variability of contribution, you're much more likely to get individualized reward, and that's towards the eat what you kill end of the spectrum. So if you've got a firm like that and you've got a managed lockstep, then you're probably seeing some tensions in your business. If on the other hand you've shifted to a more eat what you kill basis, then that will sit more comfortably with that style of partner contribution and the market environment. Obviously at the other end of the spectrum, if you look at getting a lower level of market pressure and poaching, if you like, or grabbing and leaving, as sometimes is put in the literature, then at that end of the spectrum, with a narrower range of partner contribution, lockstep is better suited or can be more suitable for those types of performances within the business. And what's really interesting over time, and this is what's fascinating about the survey, is that what we've seen in actuality is a mix of approaches by firms to being confronted with these issues. So for some firms, they have moved away from the lockstep. Lockstep used to be where it was at for professional practices. 20 years ago, you'd struggle to find many firms outside the American firms who were managing their lockstep in any way, shape or form. These days it's much more prevalent. But the reaction to these market pressures, more lateral hiring, much more competitive landscape, has been largely in two respects. One, shifting your remuneration structure, so becoming more managed. The other one is actually what we've seen in terms of de-equitization and reducing the range of contribution within a business by removing partners from that business, either through de-equitisation and becoming fixed share or salaried partners or consultants, or actually moving out of the business completely. And what that does, of course, is you narrow the range and you increase the profitability of the remaining partners. So it's a very sensible approach, not right for all firms, because I come back to this point that I made at the outset, which was it really depends on what your clients are demanding. If you can't continue to act to your clients without providing them a full range of services at the lower end of profitability and the higher end, well, you're going to be shifting the way that you remunerate your partners and you manage them. If, however, you can remain relevant to that client, but only offer services in the high profit end, well, happy days, but you're likely to be seeing a tighter and more tightly bound partnership on the lockstep end of things.
Yeah. And obviously culture is going to have a big role to play in that, as to how far you're prepared to push these issues and what knock-on effects it might have when you make a change like that, how it might affect your culture. So if you've got a firm that's looking at revamping its remuneration system, it feels its current system is no longer suited to the new market.
Yes.
What's the best approach? Is it like a big bang approach? We talked about previously. Can you go straight from a pure lockstep to something completely different? Is that advisable? Is it big bang, or is it something much more gradual?
Yes. Okay. Well, the answer to that, going back to my lawyerly days, is that it depends, as ever. If you're going to adopt a big bang approach, typically you need to have a big bang going on somewhere. So there needs to be an external shock, or you need to be in a position where internally your business has got to a point where change is really obviously needed. In which case that mandate for change and is present. Obviously, sometimes people call it the burning platform, or you might have had people leave the business. You might be seeing the business slip away in some way, and you've really got to do something about it. It becomes a business imperative, in which case you've just got to get on with it, and it becomes pretty obvious. And in that situation, getting buy-in for it, for the changes, is relatively straightforward, even within partnership businesses, which are notorious for taking time to change. But and I'm sure Corinne, Bettina, and yourself will have seen this in many professional practices. Actually, when everybody's faced with a major issue, a significant and business-threatening issue, actually it galvanises people pretty quickly towards action of one kind or another.
Yeah, it's whether it's pulling together or heading for the door.
Exactly.
Unfortunately. Thank you very much, David. We're actually going to come to Corinne in a minute and discuss some of the tools that management need to be able to affect this kind of change in their remuneration systems. But before that, if we can just turn to Bettina and ask about when firms are looking at a range of options in their remuneration systems, how to change it. Are there any particular discrimination concerns they should at least have in mind when they're looking at that range of options?
So just by way of recap, law firm partners and LP members do benefit from discrimination protections under the Equality Act. So there are a whole range of protected characteristics. The ones that we come across most in practice when looking at law firms and partners tend to be sort of sex discrimination, age discrimination, and also race discrimination. So those are the sort of the main risk areas that we see day to day. They impact in the whole range of remuneration systems. So when you're looking at a lockstep, the risk is that you might be accused of age discrimination because you're treating partners differently based on their age, be it older or younger. There is a sort of 5-year exemption under the legislation. So if you have a 5-year lockstep before you hit your your plateau, then you don't have to particularly justify that or sort of go through the reasoning. But we've heard from Corin that most law firms operate longer lockstep systems, so you're then back into having to justify why you are treating partners differently based on age. There, if you can say you have a business need that you're meeting, which can be rewarding loyalty or rewarding specialist expertise, then again you can justify that difference in treatment, difference in pay based on lockstep. Going beyond that, when you look at the other sort of remuneration systems, you have to look at applying objective criteria on which you base your decision. So if someone is awarded a large bonus in a modified lockstep, you have to justify why that person is getting that, and maybe a female colleague is not. Provided you have objective criteria on which you base your decisions, and you have a paper trail demonstrating why you made that particular bonus, by way of example, then you should be able to defend any potential allegation of discrimination. So it's really just not making arbitrary decisions, thinking them through, or trying to apply objective criteria and having the paper trail to justify it.
Yeah, it's avoiding that vacuum of evidence, isn't it? That even the best firms can find themselves facing.
Yes, absolutely.
So Corin, so senior management has accepted this poison chalice of revamping the remuneration system for their partners. So what do they need to be able to do that, sort of from beginning to end? What are the sort of legal toolkit that they need to do that?
Well, there's a range of things that management's going to need to sort of to implement a new programme for remuneration. I think the first and most important thing is they're going to need a power to amend. That sounds obvious, but a lot of people don't have power to amend, and that's a real stumbling block. I think that firms need sensible decision making by majorities rather than unanimous decision making. You need to make sure that the constitution and the document puts power into the hands of management to be able to progress the project. It's not going to be viable if the entire partner body has to push the implementation and the creation of the new remuneration model through.
Which you do see a lot.
Which you do see a lot, exactly. So this management board or committee or steering committee or whatever it is that the firm chooses to use, it needs to have clear project scope, it needs to have a mandate, it needs to have understandable objectives, it needs to have a proper time frame. But then alongside that, we need to make sure that all of the partner body do have the opportunity to feed into that process, so that they're given the opportunity to comment and to have their voices heard, because the risk is, of course, that if the system is imposed upon them, then they're going to not engage with it and not feel that it's aligned with the firm's strategy. That the real talent of a management team is to be able to take some of the effort away from the partner bodies, but to find something that the partners all buy into, all engage with, and all believe is actually in the interests of the firm as a whole. And I do think that's really important, because there will be a partner vote usually when you apply the power to amend, but management has to be absolutely confident before they get into the vote that that vote is going to pass. You can't possibly have a situation where management don't know which way it's going to go. From a practical point, you don't want to waste those costs and effort and time, but it's going to become a vote of no confidence in management, which could be really damaging to the partnership and distracting from client service. In terms of what the common stumbling blocks are that we see, I really do believe that voting majorities that are too high, or even worse, unanimity, can be a real problem for firms. Some deeds don't have a power anyway, and that can be very challenging as well. But the problem with unanimity is that one could argue that it empowers the partners and gives everybody a vote, but in reality what it actually does is allows a rogue partner to pursue their own agenda. If something will come out about the wrong type of coffee machine having been bought 6 years ago, and they're still sort of holding that grudge, and so there will be personal agendas that management will have to chew through. Whereas if you have a sensible sort of majority, then there's the opportunity for the partners to feel they have the protection and the comfort that it's not just going to be imposed upon them, but you can't have one or two partners getting their own way and causing resentment among the other partners.
But what if you are one of those, the dissidents who are overruled by a majority vote? I mean, can they refuse to participate or refuse to be bound by these new arrangements?
Well, not if your partnership deed has got very clear mechanisms, because if the process under the deed is majority decision making, then the minority have to abide by what the majority decision is. So what you would probably get in those circumstances, if somebody refuses to accept the system, is they're breaching the deed. They're not aligned with the strategy. But I think before you've got to that point in terms of working out formally whether you could extract from them from the business, management is going to need to manage that issue, because they're not aligned with the firm. They're probably a distraction to the firm. They're probably creating a lot of problems within the firm. So there's going to be a real challenge there for management in terms of managing that minority, because who knows what they would do next if they're not happy with the decisions. But technically, if they start to technically they are bound, and if they start to cause problems, then you might get to a situation where you're thinking about whether you have to exercise powers to compulsorily retire, or even if their behaviour is extreme, expel.
Yes. Thank you.
And I think some of the practicalities here are really important, because it really does depend who's in that minority. If your highest performing partners are in that minority and they've chosen to ignore the way that you're now saying you're going to evaluate partners' contribution, and they say, well, I'm just going to carry on as usual, it's a brave management team that tackles that. But I would say in those circumstances you have to be brave, because you may end up losing a very successful partner, but over time, if that partner is at odds with how the rest of the partnership wants to behave and conduct its business, then sadly you are better off without them. So you have to tackle those gorillas, both in the sense that they're large presences within the business, and also in the more terrorist sort of style of approach that they can adopt. That's essential, and that's where the real politic of the situation comes in, where you might have mandate and you might have been given the go-ahead formally by the partners, but really where does the power lie in your business, and are you prepared to do battle for the good, as Corin put it, of the firm as a whole as you go through, or are you going to just go with the powerful individuals within it and allow that to govern how you operate as a firm?
Yes.
Just an aside on the guerrilla type, as we call them, they themselves kind of expose the firm to the risk of claims by their colleagues for either bullying or discrimination claims. And sometimes we've seen it sort of in the past, we've had cases where people have been serial offenders of possibly harassing PAs, and some firms would just accept that as part of a course there would be a change every so many months, but because this person was a high biller, they would take it on the chin. And clearly there's a risk in terms of culture and overall sort of firm.
And one tends to follow the other, which is the point I was making as well, and to reinforce what you're saying, Bettina. You tend to get a number of difficult behaviours that emerge, not just chasing individual billing targets, etc. It tends to become more evident in other areas as well.
So just worth mentioning, in terms of this minority, that what's in the survey results, there was a very big chunk that were the majority, 73%. They trusted the system, and and for them the priorities were perceived fairness. 78%, their priority was perceived fairness of the system, supporting the firm's culture and ethos. That was like the second biggest factor. 70% supported that, and then kind of recognition as a partner's performance, sort of financial and non-financial, came in third at 67. But there's a very significant minority who, and kind of the question is, who is within that minority of 22% totally prioritised absolute reward, their own profit share, maximising their own profit share compared to the market, and 25% prioritised relative reward, so prioritised above all else, above fairness and the rest of the firm and the ethos, their own personal reward relative to that of their partners. And it's like, well, who is in that 25%? And how do you address that? So David. How do the dark arts of HR help us to transform a firm's remuneration strategy and to take the partners, including this potential hardcore minority, but potentially very important minority, along with it kind of for the future strategy and benefit of the firm?
Well, Corin's going to hate this, but what you have to do is ignore the partnership deed.
We do hate that.
Well, look at the survey results. Let's say we've got 22 or 25% of the partnership who are dead set against changes to the remuneration system because they want to drive the individual level of profit as high as they can. You can probably get a resolution through, maybe on a 2/3 majority if that's in your deed, or 3/4 for a special resolution, fairly typical. But you're left with this rump of people who are really up in arms. So before you get to that point, what can you do? Well, most deeds actually give you some discretion as to how you evaluate partners. Mainly the deeds are concerned with how you split the profit, not necessarily how you get to reach that decision. So if you're in a pure lockstep situation, you want to move out of that, that's tricky. But if you're in one of these hybrid or managed systems, then there'll often be discretion for the management team as to where they set benchmarks, what they regard as best practice for CRM, for example, client relationship management. And you can work behind the scenes to apply slightly different criteria to those that you've applied in the past without going to the deed and having to get something passed. And if you make that sort of change, we talked earlier about whether you go for a big bang or a gradual approach. This is one of the scenarios where you go for a softly, catchy big gorilla sort of trick, if you like. So you start changing, you try and get buy-in on a more measured basis to these changes as you go along, and over time what you're trying to do is shape the way that the partners act towards the way that you're evaluating them, and hey presto, you've got a change to the way that you're delivering the reward to the partners. It can only take you so far, so at some point you're going to have to go back to the deed, lucky old Corin, and change it. But in the meantime, there are things that you can do, and it does depend how much latitude you've got and how able your management team are to do it.
I guess as well, though, significant issues in that are going to be the importance of being very clear as to what this new basis of assessment is. And for the most part in our survey, most people thought the criteria, I think 81% thought their remuneration criteria were clear. So, but if you change, you need to make that transparent and clear as to what the new criteria are. And then secondly, and this was another factor in the survey results, that actually 44%, even though people were clear about the criteria, what they weren't clear about was the communication to them about their own individual performance and how that then impacted on their personal pay. And there was a real disconnect between over here is the system and over here is me and my performance, and there's very little actual discussion before the figures are kind of revealed as to what my performance is and how it's going to play out in the figures.
Well, the delta there in those two figures is really telling, isn't it? Because I think what we're seeing there is partners saying, yes, we've got a remuneration system and criteria that are written down, but the basis of the decision making in my individual case I'm not so sure about. So though they might have clarity over how they're supposed to be evaluated, they're not sure that that's happening actually in practice. So there's a big delta there, and I imagine that that's part of the delta that you see, Bettina, when you get claims is what's the written criteria, that's fine, but how have you applied this? And so this is where my dark arts come in, because there's often quite a lot of leeway between the two, so there is room for you to play, but obviously there's danger and risk within that as well, because you can't necessarily be as crystal clear as you would like to be if you're trying to achieve a change that's more measured and gradual through the practices that you adopt, as opposed to going for that very formal change via the deed.
Yeah. Well, and we'll come back to this in a minute about some of the discrimination risks, for example, in that disconnect,
Yeah.
and so, where there's the vacuum. But you've led us very nicely
Hooray.
into so maybe have a brief chat about merit-based remuneration systems, and how they operate and some of the risks around them. So can you just talk us through, David, some of the key metrics that are commonly used by firms, and how they sort of determine contribution and allocate reward to partners?
Yeah. So the area where there's a lot of consistency between firms is in the most obvious areas of direct client service. So metrics in this area are things like chargeable time. It's things like deliveries, i.e. how much the chargeable time you put in has realised for the business. Mm-hmm. How many matters you supervise and what's their value. How much profitability is attached to those matters. So this is actually really quite straightforward. It's not an area that is called into question much, because there's factual evidence as to what you've done.
Although there can be issues about how the systems that the firm has actually set up for recognition as to,
that's correct.
Kind of whether you're the supervisor, the matter part, whether
Yes.
you're the originating partner and forever, whether you're the client
Yeah.
partner, the supervising partner.
Exactly.
And it's the systems that the firm set up. It's key to that.
So you've always got to get behind the data. So though this is the most straightforward area, you can look at somebody's chargeable time, but they might not record it all the time. They might be self-editing, or they might be very full recorders of their time, and they have a lot of write-offs. So you might have two partners in the same firm with two very different approaches. How do you reconcile the both? Really, that comes down to good, attentive management and knowledge of what's going on in your business. And those are the easy bits. Okay, so the direct client service. You started picking that apart already.
Sorry.
And that's the easy one.
But so we got the client aspect. What are the other criteria though that typically come up?
Well, so then you're into the field of how do you evaluate client relationship management, and this is where one of the things you've already mentioned really comes into play. People who are stated within remuneration systems and the finance systems of the business as the client partner are usually the partners that have brought in that client, and that may be 10, 15 years ago. So if that client is a really large and important client now, they might have 3, 4, 8 or 9 partners and individuals working on that client, and it might have almost nothing to do with that originating partner. But lots of systems, if you're the originating partner, you maintain that bills and the reference, or whichever way whatever you call it, for the entirety of your time at the business. So obviously that data that's being used to calculate ultimately influence somebody's reward, is not reflecting the reality of what's happening in the business. That can lead to a lot of tension. And again, you need good management of your system to say, actually, this £3 million worth of revenue should pretty much be split between these 3 or 4 partners. It shouldn't just all be sat within that one person who just happens to have their name on the system.
And a number of firms now do have that kind of sophisticated
Yes.
approach where there'll be a sharing of credit.
That's right.
For
That's
that
right.
sort of-
And you see this because also clients have become more sophisticated in the way they buy legal services. They'll often want to go to a firm and get a bundle of services from them. It's not a relationship that's managed just through one partner anymore. So you go from direct client service, relatively straightforward data and metrics, albeit you've got to get behind those. Client relationship management, much more tricky. Business development. So what are you rewarding when you look at business development? Are you rewarding new business that's generated and hits your bottom line, or is it the type and style of effort that's going on? There's always a bit of a toss-up as to what you're measuring and what you're rewarding, Because if you send a partner off and say, we really need to develop a life sciences practice for this business, and you say, I really want you to concentrate on that, if we can get 2 or 3 clients in the next 2 years, that would be brilliant. But they're going from a situation where they could develop their usual types of clients much more easily than those. So they're going to get hit if you just look at the amount of money that's coming in. So again, you've got to, for the good of the business as a whole, you've got to have a way of managing how you interpret that partner's contribution.
Yeah. I suppose the same applies to the sort of the management side as well, in terms of,
Yes.
particularly in the smaller firms, if you're the trainee partner or the or the sort of recruitment partner, then you've got to devote a lot of time to getting the right people in the door.
That's right.
But that distracts from client service in terms of the money going on the clock and the ability to get out there and raise the profile of the firm and bring new clients in.
And one easy way to think about this, you've got to think more deeply about it, but one easy way to think about some of these contributions is there are contributions that result in immediate impact on fees and revenue. And then there are other contributions that are investments in the future production of the business. And without investing in that future production, you won't get the revenue that you should be in years to come.
Yeah.
The right people, the right knowledge,
Yeah.
Good risk management,
Yeah.
etc. They, when you talk about metrics in those areas, really difficult to get beyond a subjective view of what people are doing. You can have some data, but I distinguish their data from a metric, if you like.
So it can't all be about the money. So how do you then value within your system all this unsung stuff that goes to the fabric of the business, the future of the business? How do you do that, but without losing sight of the importance of financial contribution?
Yeah. The key thing, in my view, is that you have to place a value on it, because if you don't place a value on it, you'll either have people hiding in those areas that are the unsung areas because they're more difficult to measure and their practice might not be as strong as it should be. Or alternatively, you have the people with strong practices ignoring all the work to do on the fabric of the business. So by placing an explicit value on it, and how firms do that varies, but by placing an explicit value on it, you actually create a sense of how much time people should spend on it, and what the output is you're looking to get from it, and how that sits against the value that you place on the fee earning and the direct client service. So you have to be clear as to the value.
Right, got it. So Bettina, how do you assess the kind of the risks, particularly sort of discrimination risks in this sort of remuneration system based on merit, based on criteria, performance criteria?
Well, when you look at a system that's based mainly on financial performance, and you have someone who isn't firing all cylinders, doesn't sort of sit within the rest of the group, maybe because they've suffered through a period of ill health, you then quite quickly become unstuck, and the risk is that that person, if they have a longer term condition, may assert that the way they are being remunerated as opposed to their peers is disability discrimination. So if, for instance, they have some underlying depression maybe, which impacts on their ability to generate new clients or maintain existing client relationships, the firm will very quickly have to move out of the normal system to try and find a way of addressing them and pitching them somewhere within the remuneration system which acknowledges their disability and allows them to operate within that. I mean, the firm is under a duty to make reasonable adjustments. Clearly it won't be sort of an indefinite period of time, but you will be bound for a certain period of time to try and work with that person to try and make it work. And when you have a system which is purely what you kill financials, that's sort of in terms of culture, it's very difficult for the other partners to accept and understand and get their head around. So that can be a problem on that particular system. But quite generally, when you have absences from work, with any system, it can create difficulties in terms of how you remunerate that partner. So the typical one is maternity absences. and how you reward someone who's been away. So, but again, by way of recap, there is no automatic right to maternity leave for a law firm partner. You have right to 2 weeks leave. Any remaining leave and pay is sort of at the firm's discretion, but typically firms will pay sort of between 3 to 6 months enhanced maternity pay, which is based on unusual profit share levels. When you assess what you want to offer as a firm, a very useful guide I always find in practice to look at what you offer on sick pay, because if you have a female partner who's away on maternity leave and says, well, I'm only getting 2 months full profit share, but my male colleague who's been off sick for 8 months is on full profit share for the period, it's going to be quite difficult to justify that difference in treatment. So those are the sort of things you need to look at. And that applies to any of the remuneration models when you decide whether to pay someone something or not.
And interesting, just from the survey results, the greatest majority did provide some level of remuneration for 6 months for both maternity and sick pay, long-term sick pay. But there was a greater proportion of firms who paid 12 months sick pay than paid an equivalent maternity leave. So there was a definite disparity there,
Yeah.
more generous treatment for sick pay in certain firms.
Yeah.
And you're saying that's a potential risk.
I mean, clearly you could have a woman on long-term sick leave and it's
Yeah.
going to be difficult to say, oh, you're treating me differently because I'm female. But if there is a practical situation where you have a couple of men away on long-term sick leave and on full profit share, then, if the female partner on maternity leave came to us for advice, I would say we've certainly got something to work with here.
And that's really tricky, isn't it? Because in practice, those sick leave discussions about partners are very emotive, and the partners actually, when you're asking for them to exercise discretion or look at how they apply their own rules, you'll often find in sick pay cases that they will extend the periods that exist, because they're really putting themselves in the position of that person and thinking, well, if I was in that position and having to be off on sick pay, I would want to feel that the partnership was supporting me. Whereas when you come to a maternity leave situation, you're having a more in life terms, you're having a more positive experience in the way that the reality of life is happening to you. So it's a really, really tricky situation to come to in practice when you're a HR director and you're faced with these issues and what advice you give. Those areas are really tricky because you've got on the one hand the real life risks that you're going to expose yourself to, but then you've got real life
Natural
human empathy as well.
I
It's
suppose
really tricky.
there must be a big difference as well. That there shouldn't be any difference at all, because it should just be a flat system. But of course, if there is a time at which the profitability of the firm is very high, there's lots of money sloshing around, you've got the ability to be generous in those circumstances. Compare that at a time when the firm's going through a really tough time thinking about headcount reduction and so those sorts of things. What one can just see that sort of the generosity that you're describing and the willingness to stick with the agreed system could go quite quickly out of the window, and it shouldn't be, but you can see how, viewed through different lenses, there'll be quite a different result, which is...
But I think trying to get, as far as possible, consistency between the different categories in terms of remuneration pay is an ideal starting point.
And obviously you can...
Unless you can objectively
justify it. And obviously you can, have sort of wording allowing for discretion for on certain sick leave situations where you can make a decision yourselves, as though it has to be completely black and white. But I think you have to try and approach it from a sort of an even-handed approach. And just as another issue where some risk can arise is when you have a pure eat what you kill system and someone has been away, whether it's on sick leave or on maternity leave, and they come back and try and regain their original clients to go back into the normal swing of things and get them back to their normal levels of pay. Often the people who've babysat that client don't consider it a babysitting service, but consider it sort of having taken that client over and now owning them, and returning that client to the original fee earner can be quite a challenge. But if you don't do that, again, you as a firm are exposed to a risk because you're not allowing that person to be sort of reintegrated, and you're unduly penalising them for their absence.
What's the dynamic from a discrimination point of view? Because that seems to me like a great opportunity to really entrench the client relationship, because then you've got two really strong relationships. You've got the original fee earner, plus you've got the fee earner who was babysitting. So now the firm's in a really strong position. You've got all these people who have great links into the clients, and if one or other of them were to leave, increases the chances that the client would stay with the firm. I mean, is that a relevant consideration?
That depends on how flexible your eat what you kill system is, whether it allows the two fee earners to share that. But if it's very much based on individual sort of remuneration levels and metrics, you're not going to encourage that sort of approach.
No. Seems a little short-sighted, really.
Yes, and this is the whole model. Are you in it for everybody, or are you in it for yourself?
Yeah,
that's
of course.
a core question.
And do you allow for people who might be in a slightly weakened state condition for at least a certain period of time not be able to participate to full strength or not? So, Bettina, what about the treatment of partners who are working part-time, maybe for childcare reasons? How should they be treated under the partner remuneration system?
So increasingly you do see partners working part-time. That can be for childcare reasons, but also partners at the end of their career where they're deciding to take more time out before they leave. And with both of those, you can prorate pay, profit share, based on the hours or days they work. But the difficulty is that part-time working is still culturally quite difficult for firms to get their head round, and often if you get the bigger client instructions, the sort of the deals that may create more remuneration levels, often won't go to a partner who's working part-time because people feel they're not accessible enough to the client. I mean, some firms are more progressive, think that you work in teams and it doesn't really matter, and you can manage that. But practically, there's a little bit of a lag behind making sure that part-time people actually get the work that's sort of equivalent in terms of standard and sort of fee levels to full-time partners. But the basic principle is prorating is fine.
So, in the last few minutes of our session, can you just talk to us, David, a bit about the process, the actual decision-making and allocation process? What looks like a best practice process for you for this sort of remuneration system?
A really good question, because there's a widely held view that for remuneration systems, to paraphrase Bananarama, it ain't what you do, it's the way that you do it, and that's what gets results. And that is actually really true of these types of systems, because if you implement them cack-handedly, no matter how good the design of the system is, you're going to get a terrible result. Likewise, if you've got a bit of a ropey system and it's implemented really well and people trust the outcomes and the judgments that have to be made and are made, then you'll have a positive feeling about the system. Now, the survey says that most people feel that the criteria are clear, etc., but they're less confident about the communication of it, and that's what this is all about. So, for me, a really good system is where there's a lack of surprises. So by the time you get to the year-end review and the profit allocation, partners should really be aware of how their performance over whatever the given period of time is, how it's being viewed. So there needs to be some early messaging, because if you get some early messaging in place, then the partner can either adapt their behaviour, or they just simply get used to the fact that the contribution is being seen as deteriorating a bit, whether that's in actual terms or relative to the rest of the partners, etc. So no surprises, good early communication of direction of travel, of reward, if you've got an ability to go up and down. And for myself, I'm not a huge fan of remuneration committees that are divorced from the management of the business, because you tend to create a gap of responsibility. So if you've got the practice heads or the executive board or the management board and they delegate, and you see this, don't you, in some deeds, they say the makeup of the remuneration committee is separate.
And deliberately so often.
And deliberately so. What you let yourself in for then is a mismatch between the delivery of the message on remuneration and the people who are responsible for managing that partner standing behind that message. So for me, the narrower that gap, even with the remuneration committee in place, the more likely it is that you achieve that golden rule of fewer surprises and good communication. Because the Remco, they tend to just operate in a very, or can operate in a very narrow time frame and with a very narrow view of partner performance, because that's all they get. They're not doing it day to day.
Yeah, no, that's sort of much more limited and there's even a discussion about what data can we give them. Can we give them this or not? Can we tell them this or not? Should they know this person has an underlying disability or not? You know, or potential. There can be a real information gap.
It's a tough gig.
And personality can play such a huge part in a partnership business, and we all know this, but there has to be absolute confidence in the people who sit on the remuneration committee for them to be applying the criteria fairly and not to be either self-interested or interested in their particular favourite friends, and so that's a really difficult dynamic to manage. Often if it rests with management or people with management roles, then there's been some sort of election, they have popular support, whereas the remuneration committee, again, sometimes they are elected of course, but there's just so much more scope for people to say, well, he's your friend, or well, you know, you've known each other for 20 years, of course this person who I view as performing under the required levels, and on it goes. It can be really divisive.
Yes, and brings us to another point there around, you know, whether you allow appeals from the decisions of the remuneration committee.
Corin loves an appeal.
I hate an appeal.
Corin hates an appeal.
I know that makes me sound like some vicious dictator, but I just think that, well, I think I can see the rationale for having an appeal, because if there has been an inappropriate application of criteria, then it's not fair to allow the award to stand. But look at it from the other side, purely from the business's point of view. It's incredibly disruptive, it's incredibly divisive. We get to the situation sometimes where appeal committees come and they try and they want to take legal advice on how they exercise their discretions, but they then have this interest which is separate from the interests of the firm, and it's at odds with the interests of the individual, and it all becomes very, very difficult. I think it's not that I don't want to see justice done, it's just that what I want to see is a proper process applied first, so that you don't ever get to the situation where either somebody hasn't had proper process applied or somebody feels they haven't had proper process applied and feels the need to object, because of course you follow that one through. If an appeal is successfully made, everybody needs some kind of adjustment, which is going to be incredibly disruptive across the business, and so only in extreme circumstances would you feel it is justified.
And I couldn't agree more with that. But in order to have that fair process as you go along from a partner's perspective, they need plenty of engagement points with the process as it moves forward. And that goes back a little bit to the difficulty that Remcos are sometimes placed in, because they don't have day-to-day management overview and supervision of that partner's practice. And therefore they're often coming to it cold, whereas the partners who are practice heads or service line heads, they can be messaging to the partner throughout the course of the year, so that the partner actually can say, well, hang on, I don't think that's quite fair, because I am doing this on this other client, or you've asked me to do X, Y, and Z. So if there are plenty of engagement points throughout and up to the correct level, so I think this is the really important bit, that the partners feel that they can go to the senior partner or the chair of the remuneration committee at any point in the cycle, and not just that final decision point, then I think you have a better chance of felt fairness within the process, and without having to get to a situation where appeals are necessary and can be quite common.
So we've covered a lot. I think we need to bring this to a close. There is so much more to talk about, and we're delighted to talk about with you. This is a subject of interest to you, and frankly, if you've reached the end of this session, it must be an interesting topic for you. It would be really interesting just to get from each of you just the most important component for you, in your view, to make a partner remuneration system work to drive a firm's business. Corinne, what's the most important component for you?
I actually think that it's about perceived fairness. It doesn't have to be actual fairness, it has to be that everybody's bought into it, everybody thinks it works, everybody thinks that it delivers the right results and continues to believe that it serves the firm. So perceived fairness is my one component I wouldn't lose.
Fabulous. David?
Trust. Trust in the system, which is really echoing Corinne's point, and trust in the people who take on the onerous task of implementing the system.
Okay, thank you. Bettina?
Well, if you have a sense of trust and perceived fairness, you're much likely to have people wanting to litigate against you. But just to be on the safe side, if you can try and apply objective criteria and have a paper trail, then that would be great.
On that happy note, I want to thank you for staying with us throughout this session. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have any questions, please feel free to get in contact with any of the speakers, and hopefully you will be hearing from the Professional Practices Alliance again on other topics of interest. But for the time, thank you very much. Thank you. Goodbye.